Alright, so this is just going to be a little video as a lesson of how to use StatCrunch as a calculator to help my students to calculate the variance of a data set. So I already have my little per snatcher data set in here, and our first thing in order to compute the variance is to find the difference between the data values and the mean. So if we didn't know what the mean was, which I do for this and my students do as well, but if we didn't know, we would go to the stats menu, we would go to summary statistics, the columns, and we would ask for the per snatcher data, and then I would ask for the mean. Now I'm actually going to store this in the data table so that I can use it in a little bit. So I'm going to store it and compute it. And there it is, right there, the per snatcher mean. All right, now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the first computation in calculating the variance of a sample, which is to find all the values of the x's, the data values, minus the mean. So I'm going to go to the data and I'm going to go to compute an expression. And so I'm going to go to build, and I'm going to say, okay, I want to take the per snatcher data, and I'm going to add that column, and I want to subtract, the mean from that. And since I've stored that in the data, I can actually just say, yeah, go ahead and subtract that mean from it. And that is going to be what I want to put in there. And then I want a column label on this, and I'm going to call this column x minus x bar, so that I remember what it was that I did there. And now I'm going to compute. And now you see that it's filled this data with those values. So that's 16 minus 29.8, 17 minus 29.8, 21 minus 29.8, 29 minus 29.8, so on and so forth. Now the next thing in computing the variance that I need to do is I need to square those values, because it is the sum of the x minus x bar quantity squared divided by n minus 1. So I'm again going to go to the data, I'm going to compute again an expression, and I'm going to build that expression again, and I'm going to now take the x bars and add that column, x minus x bars, and I can do one of two things. I can just multiply that by itself, which is what squaring is, or I could use the caret key, which I could use then a caret of a 2, which means take it to the second power. So I'm just going to say okay, and then I'm going to label this column as x minus x bar, and then I'm going to use a caret 2 to say that that's what I did. And so I'm going to compute that. Now I'm going to do that again with the other method that I had mentioned there. So compute an expression, and I'm going to build it, and I'm going to do my x minus x bars, and I'm going to raise it to the second power. And then I'm going to say okay, and I'm going to compute that one as well. And you see these two are the exact same ones. You see how it's even put in the title there what it was that I did. So that is the same exact thing. Now I don't need both of these columns, so I'm just going to get rid of that by deleting the column. All right, now the next thing that I need to do in order to compute the variance is I need to add up all the deviations, the squared deviations about the mean. So I'm going to go back to my stat menu, and I'm going to go to my summary statistics, and I'm going to go to my columns, and I'm going to go to my x minus x bars quantity squared, and I'm going to find their sum. And then I'm going to store it in my data table, and I'm going to compute it. And so now here's my sum. Now the next thing that I need to do is I need to take the sum and I need to divide it by n minus 1. Now this I'm actually going to do by hand. If I didn't know what n was, I can always look at the columns over here, the row numbers over here, and I can see that we're at 10 here, which means that the sample size is 10. So 10 minus 1 is 9. So I'm going to divide the sum of the squared deviations about the mean by 9. So again, I'm going to go to my data, and I'm going to do a computation. I'm going to do an expression. I'm going to build that expression. I'm going to take the sum, and I'm going to add that column, and I'm going to divide it by 9. And I'm going to say OK, and I'm going to label that as the variance. And then I'm going to compute it. Now you might be asking yourself, why in the world would you want to go through all that work in order to get something that obviously StatCrunch could compute for me right away? Well, the purpose here is to learn how to use a formula and how to manipulate that formula using a spreadsheet. Some actually really valuable lessons that can be applied to the real world, because StatCrunch is nothing more than a spreadsheet, and these same things can be applied to something like Excel. Now Excel's menu system is a little bit different, but we can do these exact same computations in Excel as I am doing here in StatCrunch. We do them a little bit differently, but of course, yes, they can be done. So now that I have the variance, the next thing that I want to do is I actually want to calculate the standard deviation, because the standard deviation is much more useful to me. So again, I'm going to go to my data, and I'm going to do a computation and an expression, and I'm going to build it. Now the thing is that the standard deviation is the square root of the variance. So I'm going to take the variance, and I'm going to do a power of 0.5. The square root, which is what the square root of the variance is, the standard deviation, and the square root is represented by a power of 1/2. If you've never seen that in your math classes before, that is what we call a rational exponent, and rational exponents represent roots. So the rational exponent 1/2, or 0.5 as a decimal, that's going to represent a square root. So that's the expression I'm going to make this time, to take the square root of it. And this is totally acting like a calculator now. So if you didn't have a scientific calculator, you could actually use this as just doing a calculator. And so now I'm going to go ahead and put this in as the standard deviation, and I'm going to compute it. And there we go. There's our standard deviation. So that is how we can use StatCrunch to do this simple little computation using some of our computation capabilities.